Thanks very much, Adrian. And I'll be brief. Stein's reputation precedes him. I think you all read the short bio on the poster. He's a very, very distinguished practitioner of the art and quasi-science of good governance, and has written a number of very important contributions in that. He's sort of a public intellectual and quite active, worldwide. That's democracy.com is something I've started reading since I first got messages from him on it, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and he's recently resumed it. It's very much worth looking at. But let me just say something about why you should really, really respect Stein's courage as well as his scholarship. I at least do this well before Xi was seen as the, genocidal and authoritarian, terrible leader of the great Chinese polity that he's now sort of seen as. Stein was out there saying that, as early as, I think, 2015, some time ago, in a great book on the perfect dictatorship. China is a perfect dictatorship. And he put himself, I think, I don't want to, praise him too much. He put himself at some personal risk as well as reputational risk, being out there and calling it as he saw it. Anyway, he gets very big points for me, at least, for doing it. But on the topic today, we all know democracies in a worldwide recession with illiberal democracies and no even pretense to democracy rising all over. And most of you probably read, Levitsky and Ziplat's a book on how democracies die, and one of my favorites, David Runciman's what was it? How democracy ends, which ends with a nice parody of U.S. election. Stein is well aware of this literature and all the challenges, but has taken on a much more demanding and forward-looking task of telling us, well, okay, how do democracies live? And that's basically what he's going to talk about today. And maybe you'll get a little bit rational hope out of his lecture. I certainly hope so. But without further ado, and Stein was in, we threw this together at the last minute. Stein was in Chicago to attend a celebration of his incredibly accomplished wife, Mary Chamberlain, and just thought, hey, why I'm in Chicago. Why don't I stop by? I'll see you, and I'll see my old friend Tim. And the last 24 hours, he's done both things very successfully. He's going to get on a flight back to O'Hare and then back to London right after this. But Stein, I'm so glad you took the trip and got on the bus. And Adrian, thanks so much for arranging it. Over to Stein Ringen.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, obviously, and for your, Joel, your overblown, generous introduction. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure for a Nordic to be in a bit of American winter or end of winter. So this book that Joel mentioned is really 2 books in one. There is a set of essays on political theory. And around those essays, there is a reflection on the contemporary state of democracy. And it's on that second part, contemporary state of democracy, that I will speak today and concentrate on issues of reform which concerns me and which I've been asked to talk about. So I will do that. So here we are. Up there, a small elite, those who are charged with governing. And down here, the mass of ordinary people, those governed. And in a democracy, ordinary people are citizens, and the elite is made up of representatives. And citizens elect representatives to govern on their behalf, and then hold them and the power they control, the power they have in their hands, which is awesome. They hold them and their power under control, ultimately with the power of the vote to throw out the threat to representatives that they may be thrown out at the next election. We've seen that happen in Chicago just 2 days ago. That is a wondrous thing to see, that sitting politicians are thrown out because it tells all politicians that you are not safe. So there's a chain of control from citizens up to representatives, not a chain of command, but a chain of control. The space between citizens and representatives is filled with the institutions of democracy, elected assemblies, people's assemblies, assembled by free and fair elections, an independent judiciary, hence the rule of law, free and pluralistic press and media, and a running debate between citizens and representatives. All this is imperfect, it is messy, but it is a beautiful edifice, an edifice that enables us ordinary people to live with autonomy and in prosperity. It is one of the greatest inventions of human ingenuity. So we live with imperfection. That is unavoidable. It is never ending. There is no such thing as the perfect democracy. Only autocracies can aim to be perfect, and therefore they become tyrannical. Imperfection is, so to speak, the meaning of democracy. We humans are flawed. We accept that. We live in tolerance. Now, the way to live with imperfection is through reform. We try to make things better, to get things to work better. Also, a never-ending process, never finished. I'm a follower of Karl Popper. This book is, among other things, a book of heroes. There are heroes galore in this book, and Karl Popper is one of them. There are some villains also, but not many, but there are many heroes. Reform, never-ending, step-by-step, trial and error. That makes for a culture of betterment, of progress, of advancement, of confidence, and of trust. And the groundwork for the advancement of democracy in the 20th century was laid in the first decades after World War II, in monumental reforms, domestically, in building welfare states, and live and let live democratic capitalism. Internationally, in the United Nations system of global government, UN, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and all that. Tremendous reforms, both domestically and internationally. And if we look back from where we stand today in our present sclerosis, Joel mentioned, it's absolutely unbelievable what happened in those initial decades after the Second World War. Now, the first sentence in this book is, times have not been kind to democracy. The reason for that, I believe, is that the spirit of reform has gone lost. Domestically, imperfections are let lie, and internationally, we are on the back foot. Our part of the world is on the back foot. The great projects are now in China, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and so on. Where there was once a spirit of reform, there is now sclerosis. So in various works, I have been banging on about reform, and so also in this most recent book. It's about finding our way back to the spirit of reform. And that brings me back to the chain of control, how to improve it, how to make it more robust. And there are, I think, two kinds of imperfection to look at. One is that the chain itself, the chain of control itself, is unfinished. It's not complete. It is not strong, not robust. There is more work to do. And the second problem is that there are outside pressures that erode, threaten to destroy what has been built. The first is the building is not complete, and the second, that there are pressures undermining what has been built. So it's unfinished business. Now, on the first of these, unfinished work within the chain of control, I'll start from the top, so to speak, and move down the chain. And I will speak about 4 issues. And one thing that those issues have in common is that the mainstream political science takes very little interest in these matters. Next to no interest. Should be careful with the generalize, of course, and there are social scientists doing, political scientists doing all kinds of things, but in mainstream political science, there is pretty much an absence of interest in these, which I consider big issues, important matters, but political science seems unconcerned. In fact, the melody that runs through this book is the poor state of political science and of political theory and democratic theory. It's actually now a book that is much more critical of the state of political science than I was aware of when I was putting it together. I think the advantage of my chain of control concept, the terminology, is that it brings some order into a confused theoretical landscape. I am for my sins I'm great for order, and this concept, I think, brings a bit of order into a confused theoretical landscape. Okay, first then, the matter of global governance. What goes on above and outside of the nation state? Much of real life modernity is lived across and outside of nations. Business, migration, culture, wars, of course. Much happens outside of the nation state and above the nation state. And I know that the UN system is not always held in high regard, a complaint that I do not in any way share. It is a tremendous achievement to have built that system, and it does wonders in the world. But as it now stands, it is not developed, it is in peril, sclerosis here as in so much else. Now, part of the problem is that we have global governments, but it is outside of democratic control. So there is a democratic deficit, which is often the terminology that is used. There is a democratic deficit. Now, in a book published in 1998 called On Democracy, the great Robert H. Dahl, another one of my heroes, touched on the matter but brushed it aside. It is difficult to see, he said, how decision-making in international agencies could be democratic, how decisions could be made democratically at that level. But in that, I think Dahl very unusually missed the point. What is at issue is to connect decision-making outside of the nation state on the supranational level with the democratic chain of control. I don't know what it would mean that decision-making internationally is made democratically, but I know what it would mean that it is under democratic control. Now, this matters a great deal. We have global government of sorts, but with limitations. There's no police force, there is no standing army, no taxing powers, no power to implement judicial decisions. Nor could there be such powers without democratic accountability. So my first recommendation, which I put to you today, is to put supranational agencies under democratic management or oversight of assemblies of elected representatives who are elected indirectly by and among elected national representatives. Indirectly, elected indirectly. The European Union is trying to fill the democratic deficit with direct elections to a European Parliament. It is not successful. I think even in the European Union, we will be better served with having an assembly oversight elected indirectly, which incidentally was the way the European Union started. It's entirely feasible. Indirect elections is a method that is much in use, and it would extend the chain of control to outside of national boundaries and would create a different basis of democratic politics. Now, the second matter I thought I'd mention, bring to your attention, is at the level of elections. So we have free and fair elections, and this is where we see the beauty of representative democracy. At the ballot box, every citizen is equal. Man, woman, rich, poor, black, white. Everyone is equal. This is not a sort of romantic statement. That is a fact. Everyone is equal at the ballot box. And it works. It was the robustness of the apparatus of elections that saved America from the attempted coup d'etat in 2020, as it also saved the day recently in Brazil. I don't know if we can say it saved the day in Chicago the other day, but maybe even there. But certainly it saved America from a coup d'etat that might have succeeded. Now, the reason elections work is that we have a robust theory, a theory of free and fair elections. We know what that means, and there is agreement about what it means. And on the basis of that robust theory, we have been able to build up vast administrative and judicial instruments to protect the vote. When we go to vote, we take it for granted. This is something we do, but there is a huge apparatus, administrative and judicial, that is underlying the simple act of going to the ballot box and putting our vote in. And again, it matters. Now, however, representatives win office in two stages. By being elected, of course, but before that, by being nominated. And on nominations, we have neither theory, we have no notion of what free and fair nominations would mean. We have no theory of nominations in the way we have a theory of elections, nor do we have any orderly practice. Again, it matters. It is at the stage of nominations that democratic systems are shot through with distortions and corruptions. The American reliance on primary elections, for example, is a democratic catastrophe. Participation is low. The fanatics turn out and grab control of the marginal vote. That, for example, is the way the National Rifle Association exercises influence. They get their troops out whom candidates have to placate if they want to win nominations. We have the absurd situation of a Congress filled with individuals who know that gun control is what should be instituted, but who are unable to do it. Here I do not have much of recommendations to offer, except that the political scientists do their job and make the study of nominations a priority. We need theory and we need method. But I do have a small recommendation, and I suggest that we should introduce a fit and proper person test for anyone who wants to run for office. A fit and proper person test. We can come back to what it means. That would root out unsuitable candidates, and it would give us better quality of representation, and it will give us representatives that it was more easy for us citizens to respect and to trust. It would, for example, have prevented, to take one example, someone like George Santos in New York to stand for office. Third issue. Between citizens and their national governments is local government, an indispensable link in the chain of command. Sorry, in the chain of control. When Tocqueville, there is another hero in the book, Tocqueville, observed democracy in action in the US in the 1830s, he found that the system had much of its strength in local institutions. I live in Britain, where the prevailing view is that a big country can be governed without local government. The smallest units are districts or boroughs of population size of 100,000 or up, and with very limited authority. It is not a well-governed country. That is on very clear display in these days. And this is part of the explanation. I also live in Norway, where small municipalities have big powers and responsibilities, including taxing powers. My municipality in Norway has 7,000 inhabitants, with infinitely more authority and responsibility than those big British districts. The Scandinavian countries are well governed, and part of the explanation for that is in the strength of local governments. Local governments, they are effective, but they also create nearness between citizens and representatives. And from that, the feeling of confidence and of trust. You'll be hard-pressed to recognize this from the political science literature. For example, a book a few years ago called The State of Democratic Theory by Ian Shapiro. In that book, local government and local democracy gets zero mention. Again, I do not have much to recommend on this, except that these political scientists lift the study of local government and local democracy out of the theoretical shadows. And then I also recommend that we think in terms of local units being small in size and big in responsibility. And fourth and finally in this section, I look to the starting station of the chain of control, to citizenship. We go around believing that we have realized the ideal of universal suffrage, but we have not. One big population group is yet to be included, and that is children. As Democrats, we believe that all citizens should have representation and say. If so, we must believe that that also applies to children. Again, this is a matter of huge consequence. Two big population groups are dependent for their standard of living of transfers from others, the old and the very young. For the old, who have voting power and use it, we have built elaborate pensions and social security systems. For the very young, who do not have voting power, do not have the power of vote behind their interests, we have built nothing similar. And we live with the plight of child poverty in rich countries. Now, I first wrote on this matter in an op-ed in what was then the International Herald Tribune in 1996. It was called, "In a Democracy, Children Should Get the Vote." And I've included that matter in various later books, and now again. And there is a small group, small constituency of people who are banging on about the children's vote. And we are having very little success and obtaining very little hearing. But we do not give up. We do not give up. It's easy to fix. Of course, children cannot vote. But we should solve that in the same way that we solve the problem for other citizens who, for whatever reason, are unable to exercise their right to vote, with the help of proxy voting. There's a lot of proxy voting out there. And voting systems generally have lots of arrangements to help those who, for whatever reason, cannot themselves go to the ballot box and do the voting. You can do proxy voting. And my recommendation is that mothers should have a child vote in addition to their own votes. That would put voting power behind the final category of citizens, namely children, and would change the power dynamics in the distribution of the vote. Mothers, I come back to why? Mothers, usually mothers, cannot always be mothers, but usually mothers. So in this section, then 4 recommendations: tie supranational government into the chain of control, introduce a fit and proper person test for political candidates, breathe life into local government, and institute a children's vote by way of proxy voting. Now, I think it says more about the field of political science than it does about me, that matters such as these are considered wild fantasies rather than doable reforms. All of these ideas build on existing, accepted, and well-functioning practices. There's no reason why we should not work towards arrangement of this kind, other than a lack of imagination and spirit of reform. Okay, so much then for the unfinished business. Now, a few words about outside pressures that disrupt the chain of control. So now here deal with 3 issues, and I'm now entering ground on which political scientists have devoted much attention. The first issue is the courts. Now, the role of courts is judicial review, to check that legislation and administration is legal and or constitutional. The problem here is this: judicial review is a good thing in a democratic constitution, but it does give courts powers, and courts, like others, like power when they get it and tend to want more. A good regime of judicial review lives within a culture of judicial restraint. For courts, however, there is a temptation to drift towards judicial activism. It is, in my opinion, for the other constitutional actors, the legislative assemblies, executives, to cool that temptation by stimulating a culture of judicial restraint, including through court criticism. The absence of criticism of the Supreme Court in the United States, for example, is baffling. That those high priests are able to get away with anything without anyone lifting any voice against it. Something perhaps can be done by regulatory reform, in addition to stimulating a culture of restraint. In the American Supreme Court, for the American Supreme Court, my recommendation is to add a 10th justice and to require a 6-4 majority for rulings, and also for accepting an appeal for deliberation. Now, that's a simple reform. It's entirely within the Constitution, does not require any constitutional amendments. It is something Congress could do any day. It is not a matter of packing the court. It is a matter of a careful change that would bring some restraint to a court that, in Robert Dahl's terminology, has become an aberration. The second external pressure I wanted to mention on the beautiful house of democracy is that of social media, or more generally of the IT revolution, but social media in particular. And this, I admit, I find very difficult to get a grip on. We are in an unstoppable, perpetual revolution that is unfolding with ever more speed. When I wrote about this in the book, I went out of my way to be fair, to mention on the one side all the blessings of social media and connectivity, and then on the other side, some downsides to deal with. Today, I would be much less balanced on that matter. The problem is this, as I see it. The world of social media is full of the most vicious ugliness. The glorification of violence and sexual abuse, much of it against children, misogyny, racism, sadism, persecution of identified individuals, gun worship, seduction to suicide, child pornography, and on it goes. Sophisticated platforms dedicated to social destructiveness of the worst kind. I mean, it's absolutely horrible out there. Now, I don't know if this is controllable at all. I'm just on this deeply pessimistic. Social media are here to stay. I personally deal with the ugly part of it by pretending it's not there, but it's there. It's not going away. It's probably getting worse by the day. I do make some recommendations. And one is that we should break up the monopolies. This is a matter of good old-fashioned trust busting. There are horrible monopolies out there. And my second recommendation here is that we impose standards of editorial responsibility of managers of sites that distribute social media content. They should be regarded as publishers, and we should impose on them the same kind of editorial responsibility that sits on, for example, newspaper editors. Again, this could be done. It is being done. There are social media sites out there that are under editorial control. It is not difficult. It is a matter of determination and imagination. The third external pressure that I wanted to put on the table is the power of private money in the democratic process, something that utterly undermines the principle of political equality. This is closely linked to what I've mentioned above about the absence of orderly procedures of nomination. Now, this problem is, of course, well understood. Another one of my heroes, the economist Arthur Oken, 50 years ago, gave it the name of transgression. Economic inequality has a role to play in economic market, but is destructive in the market of democratic competition. Now, democracy costs money, and it has to come from somewhere. We allow much of it to come from private sources, resulting in the circus of corruption in advanced democracy that is visible, with political influence being bought and sold before our eyes. We take it to be normal, but it is a circus of deep corruption. Now, the balance of judicial thinking is that citizens have the right to support political causes and candidates with money of their own. Much political science thinking on the matter has gone to getting around that right by giving citizens control over an increment of public money that is put up to pay for politics in some kind of voucher system. I participated much in that debate, but truth be said, those ideas have attracted very little interest, to put it mildly, very little interest outside of a small community of political nerds. Now, I make a new attempt, but now starting from an acceptance of the citizens' right to support politics with money. I go on to say that there should then be no money going into the funding of politics, campaigns, parties, and so on, that does not originate with private citizens. Parties and candidates should be dependent on citizens for money, making thereby the paying of politics an additional democratic resource. The price, as always, is regulation to root out big money support, which is to say, to free the market of competitive politics from monopolizations. Practically, citizens are encouraged to contribute money to candidates, parties, and causes. An upper limit is set for how much any giver can put up, creating quasi-equality. That makes the funding of politics another democratic resource. The money goes into a fiscal clearinghouse so that there is no direct link between giver and recipients. For every dollar a citizen puts in, a matching dollar is put in from the public purse, whereby my donation is worth to the recipient twice as much as it costs me. The matching public money is a very important idea for me in this work, including in taxation. I have a long section about the magic of creating voluntary taxation through the use of matching money. Okay. On the funding of politics, I here add, ideally, that a slice of the money that passes through the fiscal clearinghouse is set aside for locally managed funds to support local political and civil society activity, thereby building support for not yet consolidated political groupings, and not only for established parties, and encouraging local political activity. So those are the matters I wanted to put before you as a kind of agenda of reform. Democracy lives if it works and delivers. It works and delivers if we engage to improve the always unfinished, beautiful edifice. I'm well aware that people like myself who pursue reform ideas are often thought to be naive and unrealistic. It does not bother me. My job, I think, is to produce ideas. Thank you for your attention.
So much, Stein. That was wonderful. We're now going to turn to Q&A questions. So you have two ways to ask a question. One, you can raise your hand digitally by navigating to the bottom of your screen and clicking on the reactions button to raise your hand, and I will call on you. Or you can type a question into the chat and I will read it out on your behalf. If you do choose to raise your hand and ask a question, I'm also going to ask you to turn on your camera so we can see you. So the floor is open to questions. Please think about posing one.
You got some great ideas. You know, I really like the mother's vote idea, and I wonder if anybody has tried that anywhere, because children are underrepresented, and that's for sure. The only problem, these elections are great, but you need some way to ensure fair elections. Nigeria 2 days ago, our country quite often, you know, where the pressures are such that an independent body isn't allowed to oversee things. In this very state in which we sit, they are proposing that the state legislature take over governance of elections, which immediately makes it a huge political issue, not an objective issue. You have any thoughts on either of those things?
Well, I have a thought on it, and that, you know, once we have delegated power to our representatives, they hold awesome powers in their hand, and they will be tempted. I mean, it's absolutely certain they will be tempted to use that power to strengthen their own position, and in my terminology, to weaken the chain of control. That's what's happening in what you refer to when, you know, in Mexico now, they are reducing the role of one of the essential institutions that sit between citizens and representatives. So the awareness of the importance of voting and of maintaining the integrity of the vote is absolutely essential. And I think many of us sin on this matter in that we become so accustomed to the fact that we have reasonably free and fair elections in our countries that we don't really take it seriously enough. Now, I don't think it's a mystery that in young democracies, this is not robust. Now, in our own democracies, we don't have to go very far back before it was unrobust. In Scandinavia, for example, I know quite well, we don't have to go far back for the secret ballot to be introduced. Now, the original democratic constitutions, they worked without the secret ballot. So it would be known who people voted for. And if you were then in a district which was dominated by Earl so-and-so, you had to vote for whoever the Earl wanted you to vote for. Otherwise, you'd not be able to rent land and so on.
Sure.
Right. So it's not surprising to me that there is a lot of mess out there in young democracies about how this is being done. And there's no other recommendation, I think, than these countries have to work themselves through to better procedures. I think in various African elections, it's been very easy for the losing part to say the elections were rigged. Maybe they were to some degree, but there must be a willingness to accept the election outcome.
Yes.
And we, I think, should be very vocal in regard to people in unsettled democracies, that they have to get themselves into the state of mind that election results are to be respected, and that they cannot jump immediately to a situation of crying foul. And they have to have very good reason for so doing. So I understand that situation. I think it will take time for those democracies to establish more robust procedures. They have to go through trials and errors, as we all do. And we can contribute somewhat to that by being vocal in defense of the principles and the practices of democracy.
Thank you very much. Next, we have a question from Joel. Joel, if you would turn on your camera and ask your question.
I had two questions, Stein. One, if you could say a little bit more about how you see the transition in the international institutions with this, indirect assembly. See that authored by the UN? And if so, given the Security Council power and the power of, authoritarian states within the Security Council, how do you imagine that working? So that's the one question. The second question, you can take these in any order or ignore them both. The second question is, on your suggestion about the U.S. Supreme Court, your suggestion of adding another seat, that makes perfect sense. But how do you imagine the congressional voice having any effect in the current arrangement of the court? You suggest, the court should be open to criticism, as all branches of government are otherwise open to criticism. So let's strip the veil from the Supreme Court. Just wanted to hear a little bit more about why you think that would make much difference.
On the Supreme Court, it would be more demanding to reach verdicts. You have to have a 6-4 majority, no more 5-4 majorities. Now, a 5-4 majority is a sure sign that the decision is political and not judicial. So it would be more demanding in the Supreme Court to reach verdicts. And there would have to be more voice behind each verdict. So it would impose a restraining influence on the court itself. Now, how to bring it about in a Congress that looks like today's Congress is very difficult to see, and it's not anything that I can influence in any other way than by trying to put ideas on the table. Unfortunately, there is a good deal of discussion going on about the Supreme Court, a lot of it. Much of what is being said would require constitutional change. For example, to impose term limits on justices. It's a good idea, I would fully support it, but it can't be done without constitutional change. Therefore, I think we can say it cannot happen. what I'm suggesting can be done without any constitutional change. All it would require was that Congress decided to so do. Now, Congress is probably not going to decide to so do, although there is enough pressure on Congress today in public debate in this country for it to be relevant to throw ideas into the arena of what could be done. And the benefit of this idea, again, is that it requires no constitutional change. It can be done by a simple decision of Congress. Now, on the international arena. Again, as for your question on the Supreme Court, the question is, how can a process start that might result in some reform of this kind? How could that start? And again, I can do nothing else to start that process than to put ideas on the table, which I try to do. And it would then be for powers that be in and around the United Nations, for example, to try to follow up on that. Well, it can be said that the United Nations General Assembly, which is the highest assembly of the United Nations, is today composed in large measure of elected representatives. Many countries send elected representatives to represent them in the General Assembly. And there are other international organizations that work on this principle, such as the European Council, not the Council of the European Union, but the old European Council, which is under the government of an assembly of representatives who are elected by and among national elected representatives. And again, this was the way the European Union started with its democratic representation. So it's not an unknown principle, but I have no mechanism to start the deliberation of that process, other than, as usual, to try to put ideas on the table.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to Lady Jones. I would ask you to unmute.
Hello, I'm speaking from Scotland. I'm intrigued by your idea about instituting a fit and proper person test for nominations to high office or to democratic office. But it seems potentially fraught with difficulty. Who establishes the criteria and who enforces those criteria? Who judges who would be a fit and proper person? There would be an awful lot of politicians who would find themselves in trouble overcoming that test at the moment.
Well, thank you. Now, if things are going to work, they have to be simple. There is an ongoing process in Israel currently to disqualify anyone who is indicted for any crime. Indicted is enough. And to put the decision-making authority, which you are asking about, in the hand of courts, in the hands of courts. In my opinion, a disaster, because we would get into the never-ending processes of court procedures. Now, my suggestion is very simple, and that is that someone who wants to stand for political office is obliged to file with the relevant electoral authority a declaration that he or she does not have a record of serious crime or of serious bankruptcy in business or of serious tax fraud, and that he or she is willing to provide relevant documentation to test those matters if question is raised about it. So I do not envisage any gate posts where a guard stands and says, are you eligible or not? I only envisage a self-declaration which is filed with the relevant electoral responsibility authority, and that anyone has to file in order to stand for government. Now, people can, of course, lie on a form, but if it's later found out that they will be disqualified. In my scheme, they will be disqualified and dismissed from the office they hold. So I'm not suggesting a gate, but I'm suggesting a procedure in the form of a self-declaration. Now, I can add that fit and proper person tests are now widely used in business and in organizational work. There's nothing unknown about this. In fact, it was the Football Association in Britain that was one of the pioneering institutions in this matter, which was riddled with corruption. A very respected member of parliament was appointed as its chairman. He introduced the free and person test, and within 5 years, the organization was free from corruption. So this idea in the practice of fit and proper person tests is widely used in a range of fields in business and in organizational life. And I think we can use it in political life. And there is a simple way of doing it. It's not a flawless way. Not a flawless way, but a simple way of doing it. The difficulty, the practical difficulty in my idea is that you have to have a way of distinguishing between offenses, if you will, that are serious enough to disqualify from those that we would not want to be disqualifying. And drawing that line is very difficult. That is the difficulty in my scheme that probably would bring in judicial court procedures and such matters. But I don't see any way around that. But that is the difficulty which I recognize in this recommendation.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for the question. Seeing that the floor is open, I'll ask two very disparate questions because now I'm very curious about both. So in reference to the fit person test that you proposed, it makes me think of what you said at the top about the power of elections to remove people whom you find are not doing their job. And I would love to hear more of your thoughts about recall or impeachment and those mechanisms, because you didn't offer any of your thoughts on that. So I'd love to hear your reflections there. And then going back to that, your proposals on improving nominations, I can't help but think of what happened in 2016 in the Democratic Party between within the party itself on the nomination of Hillary Rodham Clinton over Bernie Sanders, and the ways in which the party apparatus itself, the internal workings of the party, maybe have disparate aims. And so I'm curious, and certainly different preferences. And so what are your thoughts on how we would improve that here and elsewhere?
Well, I can't really say very much about the nomination procedures in the Democratic Party, except that in my very personal view, the Democratic Party nominated the wrong candidate in that election. Which is, I mean, that's just an opinion on my part. There's no, but that nomination, well, they probably had two unnominatable candidates, and the nominated candidate was the wrong one. Now, how to improve that process, I don't know. You know, I don't believe that there's any way of changing the American system of using primary elections. I think it's a terrible system, but there's no way of changing that. So I think to build in some checks in respect to the kinds of people who can stand for election will do some help, and that is my best. But until we have a better notion of what we would want from a correct nomination process, if we just lack theory, I don't think there's much more I can say on that. And the first matter was the
about recall.
yes. Because there, in Britain, for example, there are recall mechanisms, and we've had not long ago we had one case of labor representatives who was recalled because of criminal activity, and what it takes is for a certain number of constituents to demand a recall, the re-election, and then the person can be disqualified from standing. There are pretty strict criteria, but it is an indication that we are aware of sort of fit and proper person issue. There are representatives out there who should not be in office. And my modest suggestion with the fit and proper person test is to make it more difficult for unsuitable people to pass through to standing for political office. I don't think this is a solution to the whole problem of shoddy nominations, but it is something that would create some more degree of control over who it is that is able to step up to the base and stand and be elected.
Thank you very much. The floor is open. Does anybody else have any questions or comments from virtually? Oh, yes, Lynn, please go ahead.
Well, speaking from Scotland again, as you said, there is very little approximating to the description of local government in this country, and there is quite a strong desire on the part of many people to see much more local and much more powerful government. But seeing as all the power is held centrally, it's very unlikely that any government, whether in Westminster or indeed in Edinburgh, would actually institute reforms of that nature. It's really almost a rhetorical question. I don't expect any real practical strategy from you, but is there a way to persuade the powerful to give up power?
Well, in the British case, there has been a great deal of devolution downwards, certainly to Scotland, as you know, but also to other regions. So devolving power out of London is a popular idea in British politics now. But the idea of devolving power down to small units of local government has not taken on at all in the British system. You know, those of us who talk about reform of political procedures, we're always asked, you know, how can this come about, and is this realistic? Well, I don't know what is realistic. And you know, things happen, and ideas that are on the table can be taken up. I don't know if any of that will happen with any of these ideas, but I can't do anything else about it than to put those ideas on the table and try to push for changes in the direction that I have suggested. And it's not that there isn't awareness that we need to improve the ways we do politics and do government, but it is difficult to get much movement on how to do it. I can't do it, but I can put ideas on the table.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from Peter Blankenheim in the chat. He writes, in America, we have big problems building needed things because of local opposition and bureaucracy. I think Peter might be from New York City because he says subway costs go way over budget, and Rikers Island, which is a large prison in the city, continues to fester. Don't we need more regional control here?
Well, I don't know the specific situation in New York, but I would say, as you would have understood from from my introduction, that I think we need more local voice. And I mean local by really local. And so on the one hand, I encourage power being delegated to small local units. And I have this little idea on the funding of politics through a fiscal clearinghouse, that a part of the money that flows through that clearinghouse is set aside for a fund to support local government and civil society activity. That can be of various kinds, and it would be a local political matter and a matter of local political controversy, how to distribute that money, but that would bring life into local politics. It could be that issues such as the prison issue in New York could become a matter that was taken up, and an activity on that matter could get support from the kind of fund that I envisage. I don't know if that would happen, but it is a possibility.
Thank you.
First, thanks very much for a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it, and I've got loads of questions, at least 5 in front of me, but I will not ask you all 5 questions. The first point, though, is this, because I thought it was interesting you finished your talk by saying, as a proposer of reforms, sometimes you get called naive. I feel like perhaps in relation to the international arena, I felt like some of your suggestions, I kind of liked a bit more naivety. I felt like that you were a bit too realistic in your suggestion of the sort of indirect accountability assembly mechanism. I suppose that the reason I say that is this. I think one of the problems that transnational organizations like EU have is fundamentally about a lack of trust in significant sections of populations of member states. And I think it comes down to issues with the institution in how it's organized, what it's able to do, the powers it has, and so on, as much as accountability over the processes. So, okay, for example, one interesting test that the EU had was the case of Greece after the fiscal crisis in 2008. And one of the issues that, I thought Yanis Varoufakis had some interesting points in it. And one of the things that he says, I was really naive. When I went to the meeting, when I was going to the meetings, I prepared all these arguments about why it would be better not only for Greece, for the people of Greece, but also for the EU to not implement austerity. And he developed a set of political arguments he thought were very robust, very convincing, and so on. And then he got to the room, and every time he tried to make the point, he was met by a counter that was purely procedurally oriented. And there was very little space for an actual contestation of political ideas. Now, if we're to implement a sort of oversight process, is it not the case that oversight might well just end up looking at the bureaucratic procedures, how they're implemented, if they are correctly implemented in terms of the rulebook? I suppose my question is, will that actually fundamentally transform the institution in a way that it will begin to be seen as truly legitimate amongst people who don't necessarily see it as such? And if you'll allow me, I'll just ask one second question, because it relates to another thing that I thought you said was really interesting. And you were talking about unsettled democracies, and you made the point that results need to be respected, even if the process that gets to them can sometimes be imperfect. To build democracy, you have to respect results. And so this is a slight provocation, but made as a slight joke. But on that basis, would you not say that a fundamentally unsettled democracy like the UK made a decision in a 2016 referendum, which was then contested in the streets by a campaign that wanted to overturn the Brexit vote? And as much as there was significant misinformation during the referendum process and so on, is it not the case, given the point that you made, that it was fundamentally undemocratic by, for example, sections of the Labour leadership, now Keir Starmer and so on, to attempt to overturn the result? Liberal Democrats argued for a unilateral overturning of the result. Others argued for a second referendum to take place because people voted the wrong way the first time. In that case, would it not be those political elites that were acting in a fundamentally undemocratic manner?
We have no metric of what is democratic and more democratic. We have no metric of that. Very often we are met with the view that this or that procedure should be adopted because it is more democratic. I mean, the use of primary elections for nominations in America is justified by being democratic. I think it's a disaster. I don't know if it is democratic, but we have no metric for what is more democratic and less democratic. And when you take the British decision about leaving the European Union, there is certainly nothing undemocratic in arguing that that decision should be remade. We remake decisions all the time. We remake decisions that have been made democratically all the time. Now, the process in Britain has worked out very well in this. I mean, democratically very well. There was a referendum. The referendum gave a result. That result is accepted. Of course, we debate this. People like myself may be out there, well, I'm not out there in the streets, but I could be, and says it should be changed. But the process, the procedure in Britain is to respect the outcome of the Constitution. And I think the leader of the Labour Party is on that line. The referendum has been held. There is a result. We have to work with it, at least in the foreseeable future. Now, remind me of the first question again.
It was in relation to international.
Yes. Yeah. Again, I don't know how that could be implemented, but it is about establishing what you described as the lack of trust in the institutions up there. Now, as I see it, there is a legitimate lack of trust in global institutions because they are not connected to the democratic chain of control. Therefore, we cannot give United Nations agencies more power than they have because there is the democratic control of that power. In the European Union, there is a democratic deficit in spite of there being an elected parliament. In my view, it would be easier to get an acceptance of decision-making and I think you're absolutely right in the description. For example, in the referendum in Britain, behind that referendum, there was a widespread view, which is legitimate, that decision-making in Brussels was outside of democratic control and that we should not be part of it. Now, someone like myself who is a strong believer in the European Union, I don't like that argument, but it is a legitimate argument. That's right. And I would hope that my solution of having the highest authority being made up of elected representatives who are elected indirectly by and among elected representatives in the country would make for a more direct line of identification between citizens and those decision makers up there, and I would hope, make for more trust, more control of what is decided, and therefore more trust in the institutions of decision making in the European Union. I don't know if that would happen, but that would be my argument.
Shane writes, thank you for a reasoned and enlightening analysis, a set of recommendations. He asks, how can we reframe local politics so that it's more democratic and more effective? And I would just add on to it, if you could enlighten us about why do you think political science has under-theorized the local and regional?
Well, it has to be instituted constitutionally. The relevant national assemblies have to decide that there's going to be local government of this kind on that level, and that they're going to have this or that powers and authorities. So I said there are examples to look to in the world of systems that have small local units with vast powers, and it works incredibly well. So that is how that would have to come about. I don't think it's going to come about in Britain, for example, although I regret that. And it would be a very big reorganizational matter, very complicated and very big matter of reorganization. Again, remind me of...
Why is local government?
Yeah. Right. Well, because political scientists just have local government is not sexy enough to be interesting for political scientists. I mean, there are political scientists who work on local government matters. An eminent British political scientist in that field is Tony Travis of the London School of Economics, who for years have been flying the flag of local government, investigating local government. He's an eminent academic. And he is tolerated with patronizing interest by the rest of the political science community. Okay, Tony, you sit over there. It's very valid. You can fiddle around with that. The rest of us will deal with serious matters such as parliament and so on. So it is just seen in political science as not being worthy dirtying one's hands.
Okay, thank you. We have a few more minutes, so the floor is open for any other questions.
I was interested in your arguments around how to reduce the power of private money in politics. And you talked about the proposals that you made about citizens' rights to support politics and money. And it strikes me that it's quite similar as a proposal by Bruce Ackerman, which he called the Patriot Card, or Democracy Card. I don't know if you've heard of the idea, but it was championed by Eric Olin Wright, who was the founder of this centre. And basically, yes, the idea had certain similarities. Basically, the idea is that every citizen would receive annually a political credit card with around $50 or $100 on it, or whatever, that they could give to any political party or civil society campaigning organization, or whatever it might be. And this would be a way to empower citizens, giving money to political organizations. But an organization would only be allowed to accept money via the democracy card route if they refuse to accept private contributions from anyone else. So you could continue to accept private contributions from corporations or from anyone else, or you could forego that and accept a democracy card contribution. And the idea would be that over time, more and more politicians, parties, and so on would opt for the democratic route. So this strikes me as similar to the proposal you make, in which, like, there's matching public money for every dollar spent, the we matched contribution. I think that's very interesting. And I think that potentially both have some slight strengths and weaknesses. I mean, perhaps the strength of the democracy card argument would be that by saying that you match private contributions, it still facilitates middle-class individuals with more money to be able to contribute more easily, perhaps. Having said that, a downside of the democracy card and an advantage of your proposal would be that, well, the democracy card would cost a lot of money, and would a citizen's body actually want that amount of money to be spent on directly funding political parties, which are not necessarily particularly fond of? And perhaps, that would be an argument against democracy card and in favor of the proposal you make. So first of all, I was interested if you heard about the democracy card proposal, but also second of all, just if you think that there are any, outside of that, any strengths, weaknesses to either proposal and so on.
Well, I know Bruce Ackerman very well, and I participated myself in this discussion, and my own view for a long time was that we should find some kind of voucher system, democracy card system, where essentially citizens are given control over an increment of money that is provided from the government to distribute to politicians. But I think that kind of proposal has been making the rounds for a long time, and it hasn't caught on. And I think one reason it hasn't caught on is it asks too much of citizens. There isn't much money that each citizen could have on his card, and it wouldn't be worth anyone's time to bother about it. It asks too much, too complicated. My proposal is much simpler, that citizens take initiatives on their own, put a bit of money into the fiscal clearinghouse, it goes to their candidate or party of choice, finished. And the matching money is just to encourage. It's a great deal. It would cost the government only half of what they would have to pay if they were going to put up all the money. And it's a great deal for those who want to put money in, because the value of the money they put in is doubled. And it's simple. And the big money issue I deal with in saying that we should have a limit on how much anyone can contribute. No one can, there must be an upper limit, which is quite low. And that can be justified on arguments of monopoly. It is the same argument as we apply in monopoly arguments in economic markets, we can apply to political markets. So it is not to prevent anyone from using their own money for political reasons, but it is blocking the ability of those who have big money to attain monopoly power. So it can be justified with the same arguments that we use against monopolizations in economic markets. So those are differences.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joel.
Yeah, I wanted to invite you to say something about your view, if you have one, I assume you do, on rules about federalism, the relationship between superordinate governments and subordinate governments, around home rule, for example, to use language more familiar in the US, or to take your Norwegian and broadly Scandinavian example, in which you have a bunch of regional governments, but an hourglass sort of shape to the relation among the different, major governments within any national system. As I think you know, I'm a big proponent of something variously called progressive federalism or democratic federalism, in which you have a set of national floors which do preempt anyone going below those floors, but leave any local government, be it a state or a municipality, if doing something consistent with the value raised by the preempting legislation, to go above the floor. So floors, but no ceilings. And that would be a way to encourage a bunch of subnational experimentation. Whatever you think of that idea, I'd be interested in your views, if you have them, on federalism and the rules of federalism that we should be for.
Well, I'm completely in agreement with you on that matter, both on the value of local government on various levels, and that those local governments should have as much discretion in how they manage their affairs as possible. As always, there has to be regulation. So there has to be some rules imposed from above within which local units operate. But as you say, once those rules are established, there should be as much autonomy as possible on the local level. Now, if we take the situation of Britain, in Britain we have a federal constitution without federal institutions. So, we have the nations, as I now describe, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and England. And for Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, there are institutions established. For England, there are none. So there is no separate legislative, there's no separate federal body for England, as there is for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And sometimes Parliament in London acts on behalf of all of the United Kingdom, and sometimes on behalf of England, sometimes on behalf of England and Wales, sometimes on behalf of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and it's chaotic. So my view on that matter in Britain is that we should establish federal regions within England, which would function in the same way that Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales operate. That can be easily done. The old lands are there. You know, it's Northumbria, York, Mercia, Anglia, London, Kent, Wessex, and Cornwall. Those are the potential regions within England that could be federal units in a federal system. So we have in Britain the chaotic situation that we have a federal reality, but not federal institutions, or not consistent federal institutions.
We have one
Question.
more
Oh, sorry. No,
Oh.
go ahead. I don't know.
We
From
have a
there,
question
yeah.
from Lynn Jones once again, and then we'll leave it there as we're nearing our time. So Lynn, go ahead.
Lynn, we can't hear you.
And Lynn, we need you to unmute.
Yep. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
It's Jane Jones. Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to ask you what you felt about the idea of sortition. I had an idea that local councils in particular would benefit by having maybe half of the representatives selected through a sortition process, and obviously half to kind of maintain and keep some kind of consistency. Have you got any views on that?
I have to pass on that question. It's a good question, but I don't actually. I couldn't comment on it. I don't know enough about it to comment on it. Maybe you would. How would it work?
How about the use of citizen assemblies as a supplement?
Well, no, citizens' assemblies are big doing those, and I think they've got huge problems actually. But I'm talking about sortition, which is the old method where the population of that constituency is selected randomly and offer the chance to act as a councillor.
Ah,
Mhm.
ah,
Adults. Yeah.
ah. See, one of my arguments for the kind of local government we have in one of my countries in Norway, where the units are very small, is that over a lifetime, almost every citizen has some involvement in local decision-making. I need to qualify that by saying almost every male citizen. But over a lifetime, almost all the men will be involved in some way, not necessarily on the council, but in a range of committees around, and will become involved at some time in some part of the management and decision-making of the municipality. So they live in a way the ideal of Athenian local democracy within the framework of an electoral system. Now, again, I shouldn't say much about your idea because I haven't studied or given a lot of consideration to it. But I would guess that I would be quite skeptical. And the reason for that is that one of the great things about elections is that we citizens have the opportunity of electing representatives who are more competent than ourselves. We recognize that we ourselves are not suitable for the business of governing, and we elect those among us who are the most competent. Now, I admit that it doesn't always work like that, but it is one of the virtues of representative democracy that citizens can elect the more competent representatives. And I actually have much more respect for our elected representatives, even in the chaotic British system, than most people, and that I give our representatives, members of parliament, for example, more respect than they usually obtain in public discourse.
Thank you very much for the question. I'm perfect way to end. Stumper. On behalf of the Havens Rights Center, I would really like to thank Ringen for a wonderful lecture as well as discussion. Please check out his book, also called How Democracies Live. And until then, please take care.